Hello and welcome to Bring It Together, where we take the knowledge we have learned about Keyforge and apply it in more practical settings. In my previous video, we talked about the importance of reading through and analyzing your opponent's deck list in the Archon format. If you haven't seen it yet, feel free to check it out. You can find the link in the top right of the video or in the description below. In today's video, we are going to be putting that mindset into practice as we evaluate some decks from the lens of Archon format. Just like the last time we did this, I'm going to hop online and find some random Keyforge decks. I'll put the deck list up on the screen, and you can take that chance to pause the video and analyze it for yourself. Afterwards, I'll hop back in and we can go through the analysis together. Maybe I'll point out some things you missed, and maybe you'll catch some things that I missed too. Now, as mentioned in the previous video, there are many ways to evaluate a deck list. It really depends on the deck you're running yourself. For the sake of my evaluation, the main categories I'll be looking out for are the four major ones I pointed out in my last video, which are high amber punish, amber control, board clear, and key cheats. I'll also look for any general synergy within the deck to keep my analysis more broad. Feel free to take this approach with a deck of your own in mind. What categories you prioritize will change, but there will absolutely be an overlap in what we find. Without further ado, let's begin. Our first deck today is going to be Nixfire Pythas-Pendragon, Ancestor, a Worlds Collide deck featuring Dis, Star Alliance, and Untamed. Pause the video now and give it a look over, and I'll be back to evaluate this together. And we're back. For ease of reading, I'm going to color code the categories we evaluate. I'll include a legend at the right side of the video. The first thing I'm looking for here is high amber punish cards, and just by looking at the houses, I already know there will not be any. In Worlds Collide, Dis, Star Alliance, and Untamed don't have many high amber punish cards, and outside of legacy cards, don't have many ways to punish you for going over 6 amber other than key cost increase. So again, this deck, not really too afraid about loading up on amber, which is great for us, one less thing to worry about. Now let's take a look at general amber control cards. In Dis, we have Lesser Oxtet and Rockgrub. In Star Alliance, we have 2 Science Officer Kincans. And in Untamed, we have a single Musthic Murmook. This deck definitely seems to be lacking in amber control. Only 5 cards, and none of them really are that amazing. Murmook works both ways. Oxtet is not instant and very costly to play in many circumstances, and the 2 Kincans don't offer instant steal either and can be played around by your opponent. Really, if you put yourself in check against this deck with nothing on board, there are only 2 cards that they can use to take you off check. Even then, if you're at 7 amber, it's a guaranteed forge, since they can only possibly take 1 amber off you on their turn. I can definitely see this deck struggling against many of the fast decks out there. So far, not so scary. Now let's take a look at board control. In Dis, I'll list Gleeful Mayhem and 3 Fates as situational board clears, though those can both backfire on you pretty easily. Same with Red Alert and Star Alliance. General Order 24 is very cool and a very interesting card, especially if there's house overlap between your 2 decks. It's definitely a game-changing artifact, and one you'll have to be mindful of while it's in play. No board clears at all in Untamed. Overall, not great, however the deck does have a few decent spot removal cards like Draining Touch, Soulkeeper, and Zap. Finally, there is 1 key cheat in this deck, a single key charge in Untamed. And honestly, I think under the right circumstances, this deck could absolutely threaten a key charge. So let's talk about how this deck could threaten to win, because up until now the metrics we've been looking at have been pretty unimpressive. At a glance, this deck seems to have a lot of creatures, and the ability to create threatening board states, particularly in Untamed as well as Star Alliance. The Feathered Shaman is often overlooked in favor of their other witch brethren, but at the end of the day, the Feathered Shaman is still an Untamed witch, and putting 2 wards on board is incredibly powerful. The deck also has a lot of nice house cheating effects. The 2 universal translators can enable shamans on a Star Alliance turn, and vice versa with Ghost Hawk. Because of this, Song of the Wild becomes increasingly valuable if the deck is able to stay on board and use it, especially with the extra reaps coming from out-of-house creatures. If this deck is able to gain control and set up a warded board, it's going to be a bad time for their opponent. However, going for a strong board actually negates a lot of this deck's board clear tools. Red Alert won't go off with a high amount of features on your side, and you're more likely to take more losses from Gleeful Mayhem and 3 Fates. And while it was exciting at first, General Order 24 is probably a discard if you're ahead with this deck. It's just too counterproductive to your board state and what you're trying to accomplish with this deck. So, general strategy against this deck: play fast, generate lots of amber because they won't be able to take you off key, and be liberal with your board clears if you're able to. Keep their board small, limit the warding that the Feathered Shamans can do, and you'll probably be in a good position to win. On to the second deck. Here we have our next deck, Buzin, the Cynic of Order, another Worlds Collide deck featuring Logos, Saurian, and Shadows. Pause the video now and give it a look over, and I'll be back to evaluate this. Okay, I'm going to start off as I always do, and that's by looking for high amber punish cards. This is particularly important against this deck because in Worlds Collide both Shadows and Logos have too much to protect and interdimensional graft as uncommons. Luckily for us, neither of those cards are in this deck. They do have a copy of Cutthroat Research, which can punish us for going up to 8 amber, as well as 2 copies of Tribute, which could again punish us for up to 8. But more on those 2 copies of Tribute later. When we move on to general amber control, we can see that this deck is actually packed with a lot of tools to take us off key. In Shadows we have Umbra and Javinda, which can also pose as small removal threats. They also have a copy of Trust No One, which is an easy instant steal for 1 most of the time. They also have the Chain Gang combo, which can be problematic if they're able to keep Chain Gang alive and keep recycling their subtle chains. In Saurian, they have 2 copies of Tribute, like we said, along with 6 Semper Tyrannosaurus, which can potentially turn into a disgusting 8 amber steal, plus 2 amber pips from both of the Tributes, and 2 Exalted Amber from exalting the Tributes, for a total 12 amber gain. Ridiculous. Rounding that out, they have a copy of Odak the Patrician for some capture and anti-steal, and Raitor Galim for some key cost increase in a pinch. In Logos, the only amber control they have is Fetch Drones, which is not instantaneous and mostly reliant on chance, which makes it an overall lackluster card. Knowing this, we can feel fairly safe with our amber if we can force our opponent into a Logos turn. Let's take a look at board control now. In Logos, they have no clears, but they have 2 nice little spot damage cards in Thorium Plasmate and Positron Bolt. The Logos house here seems to be full of high-value creatures, and probably relies on them staying on board to provide utility for the deck. Saurian has 2 copies of Axiom of Grisk, and a Good of the Many, which isn't seen too often, but actually works really well in this deck particularly. All of the deck's Logos creatures have the Scientist trait, all of the Saurians have the Dinosaur trait, and all the Shadows have the Thief trait. So if this deck has at least 2 cards of the same house in play, then it becomes a completely safe board wipe for them. 6 Semper could also be used for spot removal, but in this deck they're probably going for a big Tribute combo instead. And finally, in Shadows they have Kymor Eclipse, so we should try to keep cards with good play effects on our flanks. The Shadows is then rounded out by a bunch of spot removal cards. I particularly like Mug in decks with Saurian because you can mug your own exalted creatures to take 1 amber your opponent would have gotten and keep it for yourself. Saurians are also usually tanky enough not to mind the 2 damage. And finally, key cheats. This deck has none. Plain and simple. One thing I didn't mention in the last video when I'm analyzing decks is if my opponent has Saurian, I always tried to look if they have cards that can make their exalting safe. Because in Worlds Collide, Saurian is such an exalt heavy and potentially combo oriented house, things can become a lot more unsafe for them if they don't have a way to protect their exalted amber. I'm looking for cards that put amber on their creatures into the common supply, or otherwise stop exalted amber or captured amber from going to their opponent. Fortunately for us, this deck only has that single copy of 6 Semper. However, like mentioned previously, being able to combo with 2 tributes still makes it a very scary card in this deck. Some general observations: this deck seems pretty well rounded. Lots of control, lots of board clear, and I think a decent ability to generate value and amber. The majority of creatures of this deck can also generate a lot of value if left alive, particularly those Logos creatures, so controlling the board is a must. However, this deck in particular has a lot of warding effects. 2 copies of Imperium, a Tricerian Legionary, and potentially 2 wards through both axioms, giving us a total of 7 wards placed by this deck. All of those wards come from House Saurian though, which means that there will always be a turn delay where we can potentially get rid of their non-Saurian creatures before they become warded. There's a good amount of amber control in this deck, however they are lacking in Logos. This deck also doesn't have any artifact control at all, which can leave it vulnerable to certain decks that have high-powered, game-changing artifacts. Overall, this deck to me seems like a pretty strong deck, and it's going to be a challenging opponent to play against. That is all the deck analysis we are going to be doing in this video. I think this is an excellent exercise to do to take your game to the next level. Take one of your decks at home, think about which metrics and cards would be most important to look out for, and go through some random decks yourself. Consider them opponent decks and treat this like it was a chainbound. Get those repetitions in and strive to continue improving yourself. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.